Mason Cole came to fix a broken computer. That was all he expected that gray morning in Seattle, when the rain fell in that soft, endless way it always did in autumn, coating the glass towers downtown in a silver mist. He had no idea that within 1 hour, his entire life would tilt sideways, that a single glance at a stranger's screen would pull him into the orbit of a woman the whole business world thought it understood, but did not understand at all. He carried his tool bag over one shoulder, walked into the lobby of Halvorsen Dynamics, and thought only about the invoice he'd send once the job was done. He could not have guessed that the woman running that billion-dollar company was about to ask him a question that would change both of their lives forever. For nearly 6 years, Mason had lived a quiet, almost invisible existence. He took freelance contracts fixing corporate networks, patching servers, untangling the kind of technical disasters that made junior engineers panic. He did the work well, charged fair prices, and never advertised the fact that he used to design security architecture for one of the largest defense contractors on the West Coast. He'd walked away from that career after his marriage ended, and his son grew old enough to build his own life 2,000 miles away. Mason didn't talk about that chapter. He simply worked with his hands, fixed what was broken, and went home to an apartment that held more silence than furniture. He liked it that way, or told himself he did. There was a peace in being underestimated. Clients saw a man in his 40s with graying stubble and a canvas jacket, and assumed he was just another contractor pulled from a staffing agency. They never asked about the 17 years he'd spent behind classified clearance walls, solving problems most people would never be allowed to hear about. Mason preferred it that way. Recognition had cost him too much once before, and he'd learned to live smaller, quieter, safer. That morning, an emergency request came through his usual channel, marked urgent, paying triple his normal rate. The company was Halvorsen Dynamics, one of the fastest rising names in artificial intelligence and cybersecurity on the entire West Coast. Mason had heard of it, of course. Everyone in the tech corridor had. What he hadn't expected was the tension radiating from every employee he passed once he stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor. A junior assistant met him near the reception desk, her hands trembling slightly as she handed him a visitor badge. She lowered her voice as if the walls themselves might report her. The computer belonged to the chief executive herself, a woman named Vivian Halvorsen, and she was, in the assistant's careful words, extremely particular. Nobody who failed her expectations ever returned for a second contract. 3 different technicians had already tried and failed over the past 3 days, and each of them had left the building looking rattled. As though they'd walked out of an interrogation rather than an office. Mason only nodded. He'd spent years working under generals and defense officials who didn't tolerate excuses, and a demanding executive didn't frighten him in the slightest. What interested him more was the technical detail buried in the ticket. The machine wasn't merely slow or frozen. It was rejecting every attempt at repair, as if something inside it was actively resisting intervention. That kind of problem intrigued him far more than any warning about a difficult employer ever could. He thanked the assistant, adjusted the strap of his tool bag, and walked toward the private office at the end of the hallway, unaware that behind that door sat a woman who had spent years building walls no one had ever managed to breach. The office was empty when he entered, and it didn't look like the office of a typical corporate executive. No framed magazine covers on the walls, no trophies, no ostentatious furniture meant to intimidate visitors. Instead, a simple wooden desk, a wall of windows overlooking the rain-soaked skyline, and a single computer terminal glowing faintly in the muted light. It looked less like the headquarters of a woman worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and more like the workspace of someone who quietly wanted to be left alone. Mason set his bag down and studied the frozen screen for a moment before touching a single key. The system had locked into a strange loop, refreshing itself every few seconds, rejecting every command sent to it. He'd seen this kind of behavior only a handful of times in his career, and each time it had meant something far more interesting than a simple malfunction. He pulled a small diagnostic drive from his bag, inserted it, and began the slow, patient work of listening to what the machine was trying to tell him, unaware that in a few short minutes, he'd be staring at a photograph that was never meant for his eyes. The IT team at Halvorsen Dynamics had spent 3 full days on that same machine, and each of them had walked away defeated. They were talented engineers by any ordinary measure. Sharp, well-trained, accustomed to solving problems quickly under pressure. But this particular malfunction had resisted every conventional fix they attempted. They'd reinstalled software, replaced hardware components, run diagnostic sweeps that should have caught any obvious corruption. Nothing worked. The system simply refused to behave, freezing at random intervals, rejecting commands, occasionally flashing error messages that made no logical sense given the architecture involved. Mason crouched beside the terminal and watched the pattern of failure scroll past for several minutes before he touched anything. He'd learned long ago that most people rush to fix a problem before they understand it, and that rushing almost always made things worse. He preferred to watch first, to let the machine reveal its own logic before he tried to impose a solution. Within a few minutes, he noticed something the other technicians had missed entirely. A subtle timing conflict buried deep in the background processes, invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. It wasn't a virus. It wasn't the work of some outside hacker probing for a weakness. It was something far more mundane, and to Mason, far more interesting. 2 separate AI systems installed on the same machine were fighting each other for control of the same resources, each trying to optimize the system according to different priorities, each unaware the other existed. It was the kind of conflict that could only happen in an environment layered with too much overlapping technology, each department installing its own tools without coordinating with anyone else. He opened a command window, adjusted the resource allocation manually, and rewrote 3 lines of a configuration file that nobody else had thought to examine. The fix took him barely 20 minutes from start to finish. A fraction of the time the previous team had spent failing to understand the problem in the first place. When the machine finally stabilized, the assistant who'd let him in stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the screen as if she'd just witnessed something impossible. Word of the repair began spreading through the floor within minutes, employees whispering that the strange contractor in the canvas jacket had solved in 20 minutes what an entire department couldn't solve in 3 days. As the system rebooted for the final time, the screen went briefly black before settling into its home display. Mason expected to see a company logo, the kind of polished branding every corporate machine displayed by default. Instead, a photograph filled the screen, unguarded, completely unlike anything he expected from the office of a chief executive known throughout the industry for her icy composure. It was a young woman standing in the rain, her hair damp and tangled across her forehead, her laughter caught mid-motion as though someone had snapped the picture without warning her first. No makeup smoothing her features, no careful styling, no trace of the polished, untouchable persona that dominated every business magazine cover Mason had ever glimpsed in passing. This was a woman fully alive in a single unguarded moment, radiant in a way that had nothing to do with beauty in the conventional sense and everything to do with joy. Mason found himself staring at the image longer than he should have, caught by something he couldn't immediately name, some quiet ache buried in the sincerity of that smile. He was still looking at the screen when the office door opened behind him, and the air in the room seemed to change instantly. Vivian Halvorsen entered the way she entered every room, with the kind of composed authority that made junior staff instinctively straighten their posture. She was 37, one of the youngest chief executives in the entire AI sector, a woman whose name appeared regularly in industry publications alongside words like formidable and untouchable. Her tailored gray suit fit with surgical precision, her dark hair pulled back into a style that left no room for softness, her expression carved from something that resembled patience but was closer to carefully disguised exhaustion. She'd built a reputation over the better part of a decade for being nearly impossible to read, and very few people in her professional life had ever seen anything resembling vulnerability cross her face. She stopped just inside the doorway when she noticed the man standing beside her desk, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered behind her eyes, something between alarm and recognition, before her expression smoothed back into its usual composed mask. Her gaze moved past Mason and landed on the screen. On the photograph never meant for anyone else to see. The image she kept hidden as her personal wallpaper precisely because no one on her staff ever had reason to look at it directly. For one long, suspended moment, neither of them said a word. The silence stretched across the room like something physical, thick enough that even the assistant lingering near the doorway seemed to stop breathing. Mason understood immediately that he'd stumbled into something private, something the woman standing across from him had never intended to share with a stranger who'd walked in only to fix a broken machine. He opened his mouth to apologize, to explain that he hadn't meant to see anything, that the image had simply appeared when the system rebooted. But before he could speak a single word, Vivian crossed the room, stopped directly in front of him, and studied his face with an intensity that made the rest of the office seem to disappear entirely. Nobody in that room dared look directly at the chief executive's screen. It was an unspoken rule among the staff, one of many small survival habits developed over years of working beneath a woman who valued her privacy the way other people valued oxygen. Mason understood he'd broken that rule without meaning to, and he began to form an apology in his mind, some careful combination of professionalism and discretion that might smooth over the awkwardness of the moment. He never got the chance to say it. Vivian's eyes remained fixed on him, searching his expression for something he couldn't quite identify. When she finally spoke, her voice came out quieter than he expected, almost fragile beneath its practiced calm, as though the question had been waiting behind her ribs for a very long time, and had simply slipped free before she could stop it. "Do you think I'm pretty?" she asked. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. The assistant near the door went perfectly still. Two other employees who'd gathered to watch the miraculous repair exchanged a glance loaded with disbelief, unsure whether they'd actually heard their chief executive ask a question so uncharacteristically personal, so completely unlike the calculated, guarded woman they thought they knew. Vivian Halvorsen did not ask questions like that. She did not reveal uncertainty of any kind. Not in board meetings, not in interviews, not in the countless negotiations where her reputation for icy composure had become something of a legend across the industry. Mason didn't answer right away. He'd learned long ago, both in his marriage and in the years that followed its collapse, that some questions were never really about what they appeared to be about on the surface. A person didn't ask a stranger whether they were pretty because they cared about a stranger's opinion of their face. They asked because somewhere beneath that simple question sat a much larger, much older ache, something that had been building quietly for years, waiting for a moment when the walls finally slipped just enough to let it through. He looked past her shoulder at the photograph still glowing faintly on the screen, at the young woman laughing in the rain with no audience and no performance required of her. And he understood exactly what Vivian was really asking. She wasn't asking whether her face pleased him. She was asking whether that other version of herself, the one captured in a single unguarded moment years ago, still existed anywhere at all, or whether it had been entirely swallowed by the polished, armored woman standing in front of him now. He chose his words carefully, the way he once chose words in rooms where a wrong sentence could cost lives rather than just an awkward silence. "That photograph is beautiful," he said, "because the woman in it is genuinely happy. That happiness is what makes it beautiful. Not the lighting, not the angle, not anything anyone could manufacture on purpose." Vivian went very still. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure wavered, just barely, just enough for Mason to notice the faint tremor along her jaw before she caught it and smoothed it away. In 7 years of running this company, she'd been told she was beautiful more times than she could count, by investors trying to charm her, by reporters searching for an easy headline, by men who mistook her success for an invitation. Not one of them had ever looked past her face to the emotion underneath it. Not one of them had ever noticed that the woman in that photograph was happy, and that the woman standing in this office hadn't felt anything close to that happiness in longer than she cared to admit. She turned away from him for a moment, composing herself, her hand resting briefly against the edge of the desk, as though she needed something solid to hold on to. When she turned back, her expression had returned to its usual professional calm. But something in her eyes had shifted. Some door left slightly open that had been sealed shut for years. She thanked him for repairing the system in a tone that sounded almost formal, almost rehearsed. The small crowd of employees who'd gathered to witness the strange encounter began drifting back to their desks, whispering among themselves about what they'd just seen. Before Mason could gather his tools and leave, Vivian asked him to stay a little longer. She didn't explain why. She simply said the words quietly, almost as though she were surprised to hear herself say them. And Mason found himself agreeing before he'd fully considered what he was agreeing to. The request came the following afternoon, delivered not through the usual channels but through a personal message sent directly from Vivian's office. She wanted Mason to remain with the company for a temporary period, officially as a security consultant. Though the specifics of the role were left deliberately vague. The offer surprised nearly everyone who heard about it, including Mason himself, who'd assumed his work at Halvorsen Dynamics had ended the moment the computer rebooted successfully. Word spread quickly through the executive floor, and not everyone welcomed the news. Several senior directors expressed open frustration in meetings Mason wasn't invited to attend, but heard about anyway through the quiet channels of office gossip. A contractor who fixed broken laptops now had access to sensitive systems, working in close proximity to the chief executive herself, without any of the vetting or credentials the rest of the leadership team had spent years accumulating. Some accuse him quietly but pointedly of manipulating the situation to his own advantage, of somehow engineering his way into Vivian's confidence for reasons that had nothing to do with security work. Mason heard the whispers and let them pass without comment. He'd never cared much for office politics, and he cared even less now, given that his only real interest lay in the technical mystery still buried somewhere inside the company's network. The conflict between the two AI systems he'd resolved on Vivian's personal machine was, he suspected, only a symptom of something larger. Systems didn't accidentally collide like that without a reason. And the deeper he looked into the company's infrastructure, the more that instinct began to feel justified. Over the following days, he worked quietly in a small office near the server room, reviewing logs most employees never bothered to examine, tracing patterns of activity that seemed at first glance entirely unremarkable. It was only when he cross-referenced access times against departmental schedules that something began to feel wrong. Certain files were being accessed at hours when no legitimate business justified it, transferred through channels that bypassed the usual monitoring software, disguised carefully enough that an ordinary audit would have missed it entirely. Someone inside Halvorsen Dynamics was quietly extracting proprietary data, and they'd been doing it long enough to become dangerously confident in their own invisibility. Mason said nothing to anyone yet. He'd learned through hard experience that accusations without proof destroyed careers and reputations just as thoroughly as the crimes themselves, and he intended to be certain before he spoke a single word about what he suspected. He continued gathering evidence in silence, unaware that the answers he was searching for would soon collide violently with his growing, cautious friendship with the woman who'd hired him. Vivian began seeking him out more often than the consulting arrangement strictly required. At first, the visits carried a professional pretense, a question about a security protocol, a request to review an unusual login attempt, something that gave her an excuse to appear near his temporary office without admitting the real reason she kept finding herself there. Gradually the pretenses grew thinner, until she simply appeared some evenings after most of the staff had gone home, carrying 2 cups of coffee, settling into the chair across from his desk as though it were the most natural thing in the world. It was during one of those quiet evenings, rain streaking steadily down the windows behind her, that she finally told him about the photograph. She explained it had been taken years earlier, before the company existed in its current form, before her father's illness forced her to abandon her own modest plans and step into a role she'd never asked for and never particularly wanted. In the photograph she was 26, soaked from an unexpected downpour outside a small cafe near the university, laughing at something a friend had said only seconds before the picture was taken. She told him that back then she wore no makeup most days, cared little for appearances, and measured her worth by entirely different standards than the ones that governed her life now. She'd wanted, at the time, to work in academic research, quietly studying systems far removed from boardrooms and shareholder meetings. That version of her life ended abruptly when her father was diagnosed with a terminal illness. Within 18 months she found herself thrust into the chief executive position of a company she barely understood, expected to project unwavering confidence to investors who were only waiting for an excuse to doubt a woman so young and inexperienced. From that point forward, she explained, no one around her ever asked whether she was happy. They asked about quarterly earnings. They asked about market share and stock valuation and competitive positioning against rival firms. Somewhere during those relentless years of performance and pressure, the woman in that photograph had quietly disappeared, replaced by someone polished and untouchable, someone the industry respected and occasionally feared, but very rarely understood. Mason listened without interrupting, recognizing in her words an echo of something he'd lived through himself. He didn't tell her the details of his own collapse, the marriage that ended under the weight of ambitions that no longer matched, the quiet, grinding years afterward spent rebuilding a life stripped down to its simplest form. He understood, in a way words couldn't easily capture, exactly what it felt like to lose yourself so gradually you barely noticed the disappearance until it was already complete. He offered her no advice, no reassurance dressed up as wisdom. He simply sat with her in the silence. And for reasons neither of them fully examined, that silence felt like enough. The crisis arrived without warning on a Thursday morning, when the entire company discovered a massive breach had exposed sensitive proprietary data to outside parties. The scale of the leak was staggering, threatening not only the company's competitive position but also several ongoing partnerships with government contractors who demanded absolute confidentiality as a condition of continued collaboration. Panic spread through the executive floor within hours, board members demanding immediate answers, lawyers preparing statements, public relations teams bracing for a media storm that could permanently damage the company's reputation. Within the chaos, suspicion turned almost immediately toward Mason. Security footage appeared to show him accessing restricted servers late at night, on dates and times that matched suspiciously well with the timeline of the breach. Several board members, already uneasy about his presence in the company, seized on the footage as proof of exactly what they'd feared from the beginning, that an unvetted outsider had been given far too much access far too quickly, without proper oversight. They called for his immediate removal and threatened legal action that could follow him for years afterward. Vivian found herself standing at the center of an impossible choice. On one side stood her entire board of directors, seasoned executives with decades of combined experience, presenting what appeared to be damning, irrefutable evidence. On the other side stood a man she'd known for only a matter of weeks. A contractor with no formal position within the company, whose only real credential in her eyes was the quiet integrity she'd witnessed firsthand in the private moments they'd shared after hours. Every rational argument favored trusting her board. Every instinct she possessed told her something else entirely. She called an emergency meeting late that evening, gathering the board members, her legal counsel, and Mason himself into the same room, the tension so thick it felt almost physical. The footage played on the main screen, timestamps glowing beneath grainy images that appeared at first glance undeniable. Board members spoke over one another, demanding immediate termination of Mason's contract and a full investigation into how such a serious security lapse had been allowed to happen under Vivian's direct authorization. Vivian listened to every argument in complete silence, her expression giving away nothing. Though anyone watching closely might have noticed the way her hands remained perfectly still on the table in front of her, a stillness that came only from tremendous effort. When the room finally quieted, waiting for her decision, she looked directly at Mason for a long moment before turning back to her board. In a voice that allowed no room for further debate, she stated that she trusted him, and that the investigation would continue under his direction rather than his dismissal. The room erupted into fresh protest, several directors openly questioning her judgment, suggesting her personal feelings had compromised her professional responsibilities to the company and its shareholders. Vivian absorbed the accusations without visible reaction, though something in her posture straightened, some quiet resolve settling over her that hadn't been present moments earlier. She informed the board she would take full personal responsibility if her trust proved misplaced, and that until proven otherwise, Mason Cole would be given the resources and authority necessary to identify the true source of the breach. Mason requested only one thing before the meeting adjourned: 24 hours of uninterrupted, complete access to the company's server logs, and no interference from anyone on the executive floor. Vivian granted the request without hesitation, silencing further objections from her board with a single look that made it clear the discussion had ended. As the room emptied and the tension slowly dissipated into the hallway beyond, Mason remained behind, already pulling up the first lines of code that would either vindicate her trust or destroy everything both of them had quietly begun to build. He worked through the entire night without stopping, fueled by coffee gone cold and the quiet hum of servers that never slept. The footage presented as evidence against him had been altered. He was certain of that within the first hour, though proving it required tracing the manipulation back through layers of metadata most people would never think to examine. Timestamps could be forged easily enough by anyone with sufficient access, but the underlying file structure left traces far more difficult to disguise, small inconsistencies buried in compression artifacts and frame sequencing that revealed exactly when and how the footage had been altered. By early morning, Mason had reconstructed enough of the deleted logs to trace the actual pattern of unauthorized access across the previous 18 months. Far longer than anyone at the company had initially suspected. The pattern was careful, deliberate, executed by someone who understood the company's security architecture intimately enough to move through it almost invisibly. Whoever was responsible hadn't stumbled into this scheme by accident. They'd built it methodically over a very long period of time, extracting proprietary algorithms in small, carefully spaced increments designed to avoid triggering any automated alerts. The trail eventually led him to a set of credentials used repeatedly to access the most sensitive research files in the company's possession, credentials belonging not to some outside hacker, but to someone deeply embedded within the organization itself. Mason cross-referenced the access patterns against employee schedules, travel records, and internal communications, narrowing the field of possible suspects until only one name remained consistent across every single instance of unauthorized access. The vice president of technology, a man named Desmond Farrow, who'd served on the executive team for nearly a decade, had been quietly selling the company's proprietary algorithms to competing firms for years. He'd built an elaborate system of shell accounts and disguised transactions to hide the money trail, confident his seniority and long tenure placed him beyond suspicion. When confronted with the evidence Mason had assembled, meticulously documented and impossible to dispute, Farrow's carefully constructed composure finally cracked, and the full extent of his betrayal came pouring out in a confession that left the entire board speechless. The revelation sent shockwaves through the company that lasted for weeks afterward. Farrow was terminated immediately and turned over to federal authorities for prosecution, his decade of service revealed as nothing more than an elaborate, patient betrayal that had cost the company untold millions in stolen research and lost competitive advantage. The board members who'd so confidently accused Mason just days earlier found themselves in the uncomfortable position of offering awkward, half-hearted apologies, though none of them ever fully acknowledged how close they'd come to destroying an innocent man's reputation based on evidence that had been deliberately manufactured against him. Vivian said very little publicly about the entire ordeal, choosing instead to handle the aftermath with the same measured composure she brought to every crisis the company had weathered under her leadership. Privately, however, something inside her had shifted permanently. She'd chosen to trust a man she barely knew over an entire board of experienced executives, and that choice had been proven right in the most public and consequential way imaginable. The experience left her with a clarity she hadn't expected, a growing awareness that her instincts, so often suppressed beneath years of corporate caution, deserved more room to breathe than she'd ever allowed them. Several evenings after the scandal finally settled and the company's operations returned to something resembling normalcy, Vivian found Mason alone in his temporary office, packing away the last of the equipment he'd used during the investigation. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking, watching him work with the same quiet focus she'd noticed the very first day they met, when he'd solved in 20 minutes a problem that had defeated an entire department for 3 days straight. She asked him a question that had been sitting unspoken between them since the very beginning, ever since that strange, unplanned moment when a broken computer had briefly revealed a photograph never meant for anyone else to see. Why hadn't he simply told her she was pretty that day, the way anyone else in his position surely would have? It would have been easy, expected, the kind of harmless compliment that cost nothing and pleased almost everyone who heard it. Mason set down the cable he'd been coiling and considered the question seriously, the way he considered every question that actually mattered to him. He told her that in that moment, she hadn't really been asking about her appearance at all. She'd been asking whether anyone still remembered the person she used to be before the company, before the boardrooms, before the relentless pressure to appear flawless in every photograph and every headline. Calling her pretty would have answered a question she hadn't actually asked, and would have missed entirely the deeper ache sitting underneath it. Vivian stood perfectly still, absorbing his words in complete silence. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked past the carefully constructed image she presented to the world and had seen, with startling clarity, exactly what she'd been silently searching for without ever fully admitting it to herself. Tears gathered unexpectedly in her eyes, and she made no attempt to hide them. A small but significant departure for a woman who'd spent years training herself never to show weakness in front of anyone, especially not in her own office, especially not in front of an employee. She admitted quietly that no one had ever asked her that question before, the real question buried beneath her original words, the one about whether the happy young woman in that photograph still existed anywhere inside the polished executive everyone believed they knew. Mason didn't offer easy comfort or hollow reassurance. He simply told her the truth as he understood it, that people didn't disappear entirely, no matter how deeply they buried themselves beneath obligation and expectation, and that whatever remained of that laughing young woman in the rain was still there, waiting for permission to breathe again. In the weeks that followed, something in Vivian began slowly and almost imperceptibly to shift. She started arriving at meetings without the same rigid armor she'd worn for years, allowing small moments of genuine warmth to surface in interactions where she once would have maintained strict professional distance. She laughed more easily during casual conversations with her staff, surprising employees who'd worked alongside her for years and had never once seen her express anything resembling spontaneous joy. She began declining certain media appearances that existed solely to reinforce her public image, choosing instead to invest that time in projects that genuinely interested her rather than ones designed purely for optics. The change didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't without moments of doubt, old habits reasserting themselves whenever pressure mounted or old insecurities resurfaced. But gradually, the distance between the woman in that photograph and the woman running the company began to narrow. The gap that had once seemed permanent slowly closed with each small choice she made to prioritize her own well-being alongside her professional responsibilities. Employees throughout the company noticed the shift as well, and the atmosphere on the executive floor grew noticeably lighter, the constant undercurrent of anxiety that had defined the workplace for years slowly easing into something more sustainable. Through all of this quiet transformation, Mason remained careful never to take credit for the change he'd helped set in motion. He continued his work at the company on a formal basis now, his consulting role converted into a permanent position overseeing security architecture, but he never used his proximity to Vivian to seek personal advantage or advance the relationship beyond what she initiated herself. He never pursued her in any conventional sense, never flattered her, never positioned himself as someone deserving of special attention because of what had passed between them. That restraint, more than anything else he might have said or done, was precisely what drew Vivian toward him more deeply than she'd expected. She'd spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from her, investors seeking returns, executives seeking influence, suitors seeking the prestige of being associated with a powerful, successful woman. Mason wanted none of that. He showed up, did his work with quiet competence, and treated her not as a chief executive to be managed or a prize to be won, but simply as a person deserving of honesty and respect in a world that had spent years reducing her to a title and a net worth. That simple, uncomplicated regard felt like the rarest gift she'd ever received. 1 year passed, marked by steady growth for the company and a quieter, more personal kind of growth that unfolded entirely outside the public eye. Halvorsen Dynamics secured several major contracts that had once seemed impossible following the security breach, rebuilding its reputation through transparency and stronger internal safeguards that Mason himself had helped design. On the evening the company celebrated its most significant achievement to date, a landmark partnership that would define the next decade of its operations. The entire executive floor filled with the kind of energy that came only from hard-fought, well-earned success. Reporters gathered for the occasion, eager to capture the traditional celebratory photograph of the chief executive standing triumphantly before the assembled crowd, the kind of polished image that would appear on business publications the following morning, reinforcing once again the carefully curated persona the public had grown accustomed to seeing. A photographer approached Vivian with practiced efficiency, requesting she pose near the company banner for what would undoubtedly become the defining image of the evening's coverage. Vivian declined, politely but firmly, surprising the photographer and several nearby staff members who'd never once seen her turn down an opportunity for favorable press coverage. Instead, she quietly excused herself from the celebration, crossing the room to where Mason stood near the edge of the gathering, deliberately positioned outside the spotlight, as he always preferred to be. She took his hand without explanation and led him toward the private balcony attached to her office, away from the noise and performance of the party still unfolding behind them. Outside, the rain had softened into a fine mist, the kind Seattle produced almost daily throughout autumn, settling gently over the city lights spread out below them. Vivian pulled out her phone, held it up before them, and asked Mason to simply stand beside her. Nothing posed, nothing arranged, no careful consideration of angles or lighting designed to flatter. She smiled naturally and without effort. The same unguarded warmth captured years earlier in that photograph he'd first stumbled upon by accident, and Mason pressed the button before the moment could pass. He handed the phone back to her, and together they studied the image glowing on the screen between them. No filter applied, no careful editing, no performance of any kind. Simply two people standing close together in the soft evening rain, her smile entirely genuine, his expression quietly content in a way that had nothing to do with cameras or audiences. Vivian stared at the photograph for a long moment, comparing it silently to the one still saved from years earlier, the one that had started everything between them on a rainy morning neither of them had expected to matter at all. She looked up at him then and asked quietly the same question she'd asked him on that very first day, though this time her voice carried none of the fragile uncertainty it once had. What did he think now, looking at this new photograph beside the old one, comparing the woman she used to be against the woman she'd slowly become again over the course of a single transformative year? Mason looked at the image on her phone, then at her, standing beside him in the mist, rain gathering softly in her hair, her expression open in a way that would have seemed impossible to the guarded woman he'd first met beside a broken computer. He told her, simply and without embellishment, that she wasn't merely pretty this time. She was happy, genuinely and completely happy. And that particular quality, the one no camera could manufacture and no amount of careful styling could fake, was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Vivian smiled again, the same unguarded smile from the photograph, and stepped closer to him, the rain falling gently around them both as the city lights blurred softly in the distance. The broken computer that had first brought them together had been repaired long ago, its malfunction resolved within 20 minutes on an ordinary autumn morning that neither of them could have known would change everything. But what Mason had truly repaired, slowly and without ever intending to, was something far more delicate and far more important than any machine. He'd helped a woman the world believed was untouchable remember how to feel again. And in doing so, he'd found something in himself that he thought he'd lost for good as well. Standing together on that quiet balcony above the city, with the soft Seattle rain falling around them and the noise of celebration continuing faintly behind the glass, there was no longer any distance between a powerful chief executive and an ordinary man who fixed broken systems for a living. There was only the two of them, present and unguarded, exactly as they were, no titles required, no performance necessary. It was, in the end, a beginning far more honest than either of them had ever expected to find. One built not on the polish of appearances, but on the quiet, steady truth of being truly seen.